With the arrival of Tiberium on Earth in 1995, the world's scientific community rapidly went to work studying the extraterrestrial mineral. Over the years, their research showed how it would absorb nutrients and other natural resources from the Earth, which could then be harvested, refined, and sold for profit. Initially, it was thought that once Tiberium had absorbed all the nutrients in a given area, that it would leave the region dry and barren. However, upon further investigations and studies, scientists realized that there was, in fact, still life in these Tiberium-infested areas. Not the kind that was natural to Earth though, but new, never-before-seen alien ones that were actively adapting and even contributing to the transforming of the natural environment around them. These observations and discoveries led the leading researcher on Tiberium, Dr. Ignacio Mobius, to declare that the crystal was a life form in and of itself, one that had far-reaching impacts on the native life of planet Earth.
Tiberium is a new life form. Quite simply put, it seems to be adapting the Earth's terrain, foliage, and environment to suit its own alien nature. If this is the case, ladies and gentlemen, we are facing a killer beyond that of our most turbulent nightmares. It is not an exaggeration to state that the future of the entire planet may be in jeopardy. May God have mercy on our souls.
The first and probably most important of these new Tiberium life forms was called the blossom tree. Not to be confused with the more common cherry blossom, the Tiberium blossom had a more transformative and sometimes deadly role in the environment around it, and those humans or animals that found themselves near it. All Tiberium blossoms once started out as normal trees, whether they be oaks, pines, maples, or other species. When first making contact with Tiberium, or more specifically, the spores that emanate from the crystals themselves, no noticeable change occurs with them. However, after a period of roughly 2 weeks, the tree will have gone through an obvious transformation, having had its genetic code altered. The bark of the tree will become a red-colored, flesh-like material, with barnacle-looking holes scattered throughout its surface. In some cases, tall trees, such as pines, will even become shorter and lose some of their branches. The most noticeable feature are the bulbs that form on the main branches of the tree. Typically, each tree will only have 1 or 2 of these bulbs. The entire upper half may have even formed one massive bulb, but they are the most important aspect of the blossom. The bulbs will periodically pulsate and release Tiberium spores into the air. These spores will then land on the ground nearby, where they will grow into Tiberium, quickly forming a new field around the blossom. Of course, some of the spores could get carried away by wind, in which case they will either land on the ground elsewhere to form a new field, or make contact with another tree and transform it into a Tiberium blossom. This seems to be the primary method by which Tiberium was able to spread to nearly every part of the world, and could be one of the reasons why it grows faster in more temperate or tropical environments, as they feature a greater abundance of vegetation compared to desert or Arctic regions. Once a tree has been transformed into a blossom, there is no way to reverse the process. Therefore, the only way to stop the tree from continuing to spread spores is by setting it on fire and burning the thing down. Of course, one needs to wear adequate protection when next to one of these trees. A human just walking through a Tiberium field unprotected will eventually succumb to the spore's toxic effects. However, being next to a blossom will only make this process much quicker, due to the increased spore levels around it. At least, that's how it works when next to a fully grown blossom. Smaller blossom trees, such as this one found in CNC Renegade, inside of Kane's Cairo Temple, don't have any effect on the player, as it does not produce any spores. This is most likely due to the fact that it hasn't been fully mutated yet, or perhaps it was part of a Nod lab experiment. Even though GDI emerged as the victors of the First Tiberium War, they were unable to make any real progress in stopping the proliferation of Tiberium across the world. By the time of the Second Tiberium War, in the year 2030, the Earth that humans once knew now looked more like an inhospitable alien planet, rather than a habitable place to call home. As scientist Gabrielle Boudreau said in the Firestorm Manual, "Thousands of species, flora and fauna, even our ecosystem are being driven to the point of extinction, or worse, they are rapidly evolving into something unknown to us. We are seeing the laws of evolution set down by Darwin being torn asunder. Mutations and aberrations are occurring on a global scale with more frequency and with speeds that defy all known science." In addition to the blossom trees, which were now an all too common sight, new Tiberium flora had emerged. one of which was another kind of tree. Since I couldn't find an official name for it, I will simply refer to this tree as the Tiberian palm, since it sort of reminds me of a palm tree, albeit a heavily mutated one. It had a similar outer layer material to that of the blossom, and featured a maroon color. The interior of it seems to be filled with Tiberium, which one can see through the holes located around the entire trunk of the tree. The branches are at the top of it, and grow out in all directions. At the very tips of these branches is a small, translucent bulb filled with Tiberium fluid. These palms are typically seen around either green Tiberium fields or puddles of Tiberium sludge. Tiberium sludge is a green goo that is interlaced with Tiberium crystals that form out of it. The sludge seems to be a byproduct of the palms and other Tiberium-based flora, such as the blossom tree. Another one was a brown-colored, oval-shaped plant. Just like with the palm, there really isn't an official name for this one, so I refer to it either as the Tiberium acorn or Tiberium clam. The reason for the latter name is because it seems to split open just like an actual clam, with green sludge spilling out of the plant's inner shell. Some of the Tiberium even seems to grow tendrils upward at the top of it as well. The next plant is a large blue-colored one, which I'll just call the vinifera plant, since it is commonly seen growing around fields of blue Tiberium, also known as Tiberium vinifera if using its scientific name, with the scientific name for green Tiberium being Tiberium riparius. The vinifera plant is large and bulbous. The outer skin of the main body is a semi-transparent blue color, with what look to be purple veins on the inside. Black roots grow out and into the ground at the bottom of it. Black-colored branches grow out from its sides and have yellow-colored tips. The top of the plant features red or brown-colored petals, which open up to release what can be best described as a pollen of some kind, given its yellow or sometimes light blue color. Though it could also be Tiberium spores that are released into the atmosphere, similar to those of the blossom trees. This plant might also give off a byproduct, not in the form of a green sludge, but instead, a kind of moss. Though this moss can also be seen around blue Tiberium fields, absent of the plant itself. Tiberium flora wasn't just limited to land. One of the most common forms of aquatic life was an algae that existed on the surface of oceans, rivers, and lakes. More information is provided from the Firestorm manual. Quote, "Green and blue Tiberium have been noticed on the sea floor along with a new form of algae colonies floating on the surface of nearly every ocean. Highly toxic in nature, these colonies are connected to small strands that attach back down to the sea floor, currently making sea voyages nearly impossible. This altered form of Tiberium does not seem to have any of the beneficial side effects of its land-based counterparts, an example, the leaching of useful elements. Unfortunately, these colonies are slowly spreading towards our inland waterways. This development threatens to damage our drinking water supply, and if we cannot stem the growth of this process, we may have much less time than we think." Other, but less commonly seen Tiberium plant life included what I'll call the Tiberian stalk. A long, thin plant with a DNA-shaped strand spiraling to the top of it. A large bulb sits at said top and releases toxic gas into the atmosphere. Another was what looks to be some kind of large fungus that would grow upward from the ground, featuring a translucent yellow skin in which one could observe many veins on the inside. A smaller, dead-looking plant with a decent-sized chunk of blue Tiberium in the middle of it, with smaller vinifera crystals embedded throughout the rest of the body. Gold-colored plants with a wide base, and thin stem protruding up from the middle of it. And finally, through unofficial eyewitness accounts, sightings of a massive organic structure, one that featured two large violet and yellow-colored legs, which supported a large translucent bulb full of liquid Tiberium. Tiberium wasn't the only thing inside it, though. Some kind of a growth or tumor could also be seen, one that featured black dots and small tentacles or stems throughout it. Perhaps it's some kind of seed, or even more disturbing, a creature that is yet to be hatched from its cocoon. A new Tiberium animal to add to the list of Tiberium-related fauna that now existed during this time period. The first and most common creature of Tiberium origin was the Visceroid. These creatures were first sighted during, and perhaps even before, the First Tiberium War. These small, though sometimes large, round-shaped blobs would typically be seen near sources of Tiberium, whether those sources be actual fields of the crystal, near containers that leak Tiberium, or Tiberium-based weapons, particularly those weapons used by the Brotherhood of Nod, such as the chemical sprayer, Tiberian auto rifle, and fléchette gun. How exactly these creatures are formed to begin with is somewhat disturbing. Whenever any organic being, such as a human or other animal, die due to extreme levels of Tiberium exposure, the organic matter of their body breaks down and forms these blobs of flesh. Parts of the previous being can even be seen within the blob's mass, such as mouths or eyeballs. While this decomposing and transformation process does not always occur, it happens often enough to be considered a factor. Further information can be gleaned from the Firestorm manual. Tiberium gas corrupts and breaks down virtually all living tissues that comes into contact with it, both plant or animal matter. While limited exposure can be treated, long-term exposure, even with protection, causes a spontaneous breakdown of the tissues. This change is virtually instantaneous once saturation levels in the cells reach a certain point. There have been some unsubstantiated reports of visceroids reproducing, but most seem to be formed from the breakdown of terrestrial tissues. The typically orange or pink-colored visceroid was highly erratic in its behavior. Sometimes the creatures would be harmless towards other humans or animals nearby them. Other times, however, they would attack any and everything in their vicinity. During the events of the First Tiberium War, this typically came in the form of expelling toxic gas out the visceroid's mouth, which really could be anywhere on its body. This same gas was also capable of transforming its victims into a new visceroid as well. All weapons, with the exception of Tiberium-based ones, were effective against these creatures, flamethrowers proving to be the most effective. Visceroids encountered during the events of the Second Tiberium War seem to have evolved. The newest forms are a collection of pre-sentient protoplasm. While smaller versions of the visceroids are relatively harmless, larger specimens can destroy entire cities. Using lightning-quick pseudopods to attack their prey, they can absorb a great deal of the kinetic energy, which contributes to their survival rate. Contact with these creatures is as deadly as touching pure Tiberium. So the smaller, less aggressive visceroids were called babies, only fighting humans or other animals in self-defense. The adults were more aggressive though, sometimes even seeking out other things to destroy, whether they be infantry, vehicles, or structures. Smaller visceroids can merge to form larger versions, which are the more dangerous specimens. Because of its direct connection to Tiberium, the visceroid appears to use the substance to repair damaged tissue, making them all but impossible to destroy in a Tiberium field. It is unclear at present what use the visceroids are to this newly forming ecosystem. In addition, if GDI or Nod forces managed to kill one, it would leave behind green Tiberium crystals on the ground where it had died. Visceroids were not as common of a sight during the Third Tiberium War, but in particular, they would spawn from the victims of Skrin corruptors. These kinds were a little different from the previous types of the First and Second War, as they had 3 legs with which to walk around on, and like the visceroids seen during the First War, they also released toxic gas as their primary attack. Even though these creatures spawned from the Corruptor's Tiberium attack, they wouldn't necessarily be under the control of the Skrin. The visceroids would still attack anything that they feel threatened them, though they didn't seem to combine to form a larger adult like previous specimens. When visceroids weren't busy fighting or defending themselves, they would just wander aimlessly across the land, preferring to stay within the vicinity of a Tiberium field. There was another creature that had first been sighted in limited numbers during the First Tiberium War, one that had become an all too common sight during the Second War. This creature, or plant, was the Veinhole monster, again referencing the Firestorm manual. Veinholes are a newly discovered phenomena seen during the Second Tiberium War. Similar to the crystalline forms, Tiberium veins spread, but at a much more alarming rate. Unlike the blue or green Tiberium, the veins do not seem to leach the soil of nutrients, but cover it completely. Invariably, the veins originate from a large central mass, which has several animal aspects, including a mouth of sorts. Many witnesses have seen living creatures torn apart by the veins, with those parts moved to the central mouth and, it is rumored, consumed. It is highly agitated by vibrations and kinetic energy, and will tear apart anything using pseudopods formed from the vein materials. Smaller units, such as our infantry and light vehicles, can usually cross before sufficiently agitating the veins. Any units that came close to the mouth would cause it to retreat down into the hole. The veins also won't grow where a Tiberium field is located, nor do they seem to be able to grow up steep inclines. They could even be somewhat contained by walls, though I imagine the veins would eventually grow under or even over them. I suspect that the vein hole monster, as it is called, is similar to a terrestrial Venus flytrap, collecting living tissues in order to spread its mass further. Thankfully, this creature is relatively easy to dispatch, as the life of the hole is tied to the mouth. Killing the central mass destroys the hole, where the remaining veins' mass withers and slowly dies. As observed in field tests, hover-capable vehicles, aircraft, or infantry are highly recommended for this task. However, the defense mechanism of the VHM is still deadly. It emits clouds of highly concentrated Tiberium gas when its life is threatened. This gas can damage any vehicles near it, and even kill infantry. Although the veins of the monster will slowly wither and die when the mouth is destroyed, they could still cause damage to heavy vehicles moving over them. Another important note is that the veins furthest away from the center will be the first to die off, with the rest slowly dying towards the center of where the mouth once was. The best way to avoid a vein hole and the surface area it occupied was to go around it, though sometimes that option was not available. For GDI, they would airlift their vehicles over them, or as previously mentioned, they would make use of their hovertech platforms, such as the MLRS, to hover over the vein-covered surfaces. For the Brotherhood of Nod, they could use their subterranean vehicles to dig under them, or they could trim the veins away, using a special vehicle that they called the Weed Eater. The vehicle functions as an oversized lawnmower, making it another kind of harvester. Only instead of harvesting Tiberium crystals, it harvested the veins of a vein hole monster. Once it had gathered enough, it would bring the full load to a Tiberium waste facility. On a side note, as with all fanatic groups of late, Nod has found a use for the VHM. The veins seem to be composed of a solidified version of the gas that the crystalline Tiberium emits. Nod has found a way to harvest this substance and place it in a warhead delivery system. Using such a weapon is an unspeakable act, since the detonation of such a device would not only corrode most materials in the area, but also subject any living tissues to the Tiberium gas, almost certainly dissolving those within the blast, potentially turning them into visceroids. It's also important to note that Nod made considerable use of these missiles in order to further accelerate the spread of Tiberium across Europe during the Second Tiberium War. In addition to the vein hole monster, another hostile specimen was the Tiberium floater. This jellyfish-looking creature would float a few meters off the ground. Perhaps it was once a normal jellyfish in the ocean, but was mutated over time by Tiberium. Its main body had semi-transparent yellow skin, with green sensor tendrils protruding from its sides. The floater had a hole on its side with which it used to expel toxic gas that would propel the creature forward in the direction it wished to go. Under the body extend a few stinging feeder tentacles. These tentacles were what the floater used to catch prey with which to eat, or to just defend itself from attacks. It would generate an electrical current through its tentacles in order to shock nearby prey. This form of attack was effective against infantry, vehicles, and even structures. The floater was very aggressive, attacking anything that it sensed nearby it. It was also quite resilient too, able to withstand a few shots by Titans or Tick tanks. When the creature did die, it would leave behind a small cluster of Tiberium crystals on the ground beneath it. There was a peculiar case of a group of humans actually worshipping one of these floaters. This was observed when a small squad of GDI and Forgotten troops, backed up by a Juggernaut Walker, went into the forests of Bolivia in South America in order to retrieve a fragment of the Tacitus. It turned out that these humans were part of a cult led by a man named Mortimer, who had the power to tame Tiberium wildlife. In the end, Mortimer would be killed by the squad's Ghost Stalker, with his own guards committing suicide shortly after his death. The floater wasn't the only Tiberium creature Mortimer had tamed. The last, but certainly not least of these animals, was the Tiberium Fiend. Just how the floater might have been a mutated version of an actual jellyfish, the Fiend was most likely mutated from dogs or wolves. Quoting again from Dr. Boudreau in the Firestorm manual. While I would prefer to call this creature Canis tiberius, the popular nomenclature insists that it is a fiend, and in retrospect, that may be right. Indeed, even the appellation of Canis is misleading, for the fiend is canine in shape only. This fiend is another example of Earth's lifeforms being changed or re-engineered by the Tiberium poisoning. Unlike visceroids, which break down and change the consistency of the living tissues, the Tiberium fiend is some sort of forced evolution from existing lifeforms. The fiend usually appears as a quadruped similar in shape to a terrestrial dog, but more the size of a large horse or small elephant. The underlying skin is usually a blackish brown to red color, but in most cases this is completely covered by a growth of pure Tiberium crystals on its back. The Fiend has also adapted to its environment. It shares the Visceroid's ability to heal itself in Tiberium, and is well camouflaged against detection when it burrows in a Tiberium field. In addition, the Fiend has the ability to launch Tiberium shards from its body with incredible force, causing severe punctures and/or lacerations, as well as poisoning from the Tiberium itself. In addition to this information, the Fiend seems to be highly territorial and tended to be grouped in packs of 3 or 4. Its Tiberium shard attack was effective against both infantry and vehicles. I have to imagine that the Fiend could also use its teeth to bite prey that were too close to it as a secondary attack. While both GDI and the Brotherhood had to either avoid or violently deal with these hostile fiends, the Forgotten, humans who had also been mutated by Tiberium, were able to maintain a positive relationship with these creatures. The Fiend is obviously meant to be the predator of this new ecosystem. It is incredibly aggressive, yet remarkably intelligent as well. There are documented cases of members of the Forgotten training, if not domesticating, fiends for use as guard dogs. Specimens have also been responding to perceived acts of kindness. Just like with other Tiberium life, when a fiend is killed, it leaves behind a small cluster of crystals. Most Tiberium flora and fauna would live and fight in harmony with each other. There were 2 notable instances of this. The first being when the Brotherhood's AI, Cabal, ordered a Nod commander to carry out an experiment for it. This experiment involved using a group of toxin soldiers to use specially made darts to, let's say, persuade civilians in local villages to rile up Tiberium creatures on an island named the Genesis Pit. The name Genesis being a reference to the first book of the Hebrew Bible, and part of the Old Testament in the Christian Bible. Once the creatures were sufficiently agitated, they immediately went out and destroyed the local villages around them, eventually making their way over to a nearby GDI base and destroying it as well. Those civilians who survived the wildlife attacks eventually succumbed to the dart's toxins and died. Another such instance, possibly related to the first, was a group of Tiberium lifeforms that were headed toward a GDI-controlled region called Colony 3.
Hostile Tiberium lifeforms have been detected at multiple locations surrounding Colony 3. Immediate civilian evacuation advised.
The GDI commander that assumed control of military forces in the area had to evacuate as many civilians as possible from the attacking lifeforms, which included fiends, floaters, and visceroids. Though many of the villages in the area had been either severely damaged or destroyed, the GDI base remained mostly intact by the time reinforcements had arrived, and all Tiberium lifeforms had been neutralized, with the surviving civilians being airlifted to a safe location. By the time of the Third Tiberium War in the year 2047, practically all of this Tiberium flora and fauna would seemingly vanish. The question then is, what happened to it all? I believe this answer can be directly tied to the evolution of Tiberium itself. This evolution occurred sometime during the interim years between the Firestorm Crisis and Third Tiberium War, according to the intelligence database from Command & Conquer 3. Early forms of Tiberium were almost organic, sprouting out of the ground in what seemed to be plant-like pods, leaching minerals out of the earth and emitting clouds of toxic gas. Over time, Tiberium showed it had the ability to evolve and change. By 2047, most Tiberium on Earth has manifested in what we know as its most common form, a self-replicating proton lattice that turns any matter it touches into more of itself, giving off powerful radiation in the process. It can change anything it comes into contact with into more Tiberium. So basically, this new form of Tiberium is not organic-based like in previous years. The mineral no longer needs to mutate or evolve other lifeforms in order to help further spread itself across the planet. Instead, it just simply transforms both organic lifeforms and non-organic materials directly into more of itself at a molecular level. It also seems to rely far more on veins beneath the surface of the Earth in order to spread itself further. With this transformation came the eradication of all flora associated with the green crystal. In fact, we can even see the carcasses of dead blossom trees throughout red and yellow zones in Command & Conquer 3. No algae can be seen in any of the waters in the game either. It's safe to assume then that the same fate befell all the Tiberium fauna, with the one exception being the Visceroid, as the creature could spawn from the victims of Skrin corruptors. Of course, one could categorize the Skren themselves as Tiberium-based lifeforms, only they are far more intelligent compared to the previously mentioned plants and animals. Now, I do have a theory as to exactly what happened to the Veinhole monsters. If you look at the chasms that Tiberium is commonly seen growing out of in CNC3, I couldn't help but notice the similarities between them and the initial sightings of the Veinhole during the First Tiberium War. Particularly in a cutscene from Tiberian Dawn, which features a helicopter flying over a field of blossom trees, visceroids, and Veinholes. So perhaps when the evolution of Tiberium occurred, the Veinholes died off, and the holes where their mouths used to be became the very chasms of Tiberium seen throughout CNC3. Of course, I don't think that's the origin of all the chasms, as it is mentioned that underground Tiberium crystals will break through the surface of the Earth, creating their own holes in the ground. But I thought it might still be something worth considering, as I doubt GDI would have been able to kill off all of the Veinholes on their own, even with their new sonic weapons. If this evolution killed off all of the flora and fauna, then surely it would have killed off all those humans mutated by Tiberium as well. That doesn't appear to be the case though, as mutant marauders living in hovels can be hired as mercenaries by those willing to pay for their services. These marauders appear to be separate, or at least former denizens of the mutants that made up the faction of the Forgotten, who went into a self-imposed exile away from the colonies of non-mutated humans in the year 2042. So if the Forgotten survived said Tiberium evolution, then perhaps there might even be some domesticated fiends that survived with them. And if some fiends could have survived, then so too could some of the floaters, or even plants such as the blossom tree. It very well could be that elsewhere on the planet, there exists a hidden oasis of Tiberium flora and fauna, such as that seen in the forests of Bolivia or the Genesis Pit. We may never know the answer, but one can't help but keep that possibility in mind, so long as Tiberium continues to exist on planet Earth.